Okay, welcome everybody to Vernacular Verbose. This is episode 1, or I guess maybe we should say episode 0, of a brand new Jethro Tull fan podcast. My name's Joey Vetter.
And my name's Eugene Manko.
We are two Jethro Tull fans. We just met each other on Facebook, actually, at the Jethro Tull group on Facebook. Just the good old-fashioned way, I guess, just sort of met each other in the comment section. And we got together and talked, and we had this idea to do a podcast about Tull, about the music of Tull, some of the history of Tull, the different musical themes of Tull albums, and all the different things that make Tull a band that we both love and that we both have a long history with. We're sort of doing this podcast, I think specifically, it's kind of made by fans for fans. We're going to be taking you through the whole history of the band and their music and sort of taking a critical eye to a lot of the different pieces of music and different eras of Tull history. So the first thing that we're kind of looking at doing is the main idea of the podcast is to go through album by album, and we're going to be doing track by track overviews of every single album, which is a pretty big commitment for us, right? So that's what I think 21 albums going from This Was to the Christmas album. So it's going to be a pretty big commitment on our part. But we're going to be kind of looking at going track by track, giving you our personal sort of reactions to the different albums and their themes and their different tracks, discussing sort of the changes in history and lineups and things in Tull history across albums, and really kind of digging into, I think, the musical meat of what makes those albums what they are and their place in history. Eugene, why don't you kind of tell us a little about why we think Tull is a good subject for a podcast like this?
Well, first of all, because there's so much material.
Yeah.
And it's such a diverse band, and it's developed so much over the years. And I think looking at the people who are listening to Tull today, in addition to the fans that have been around since the 70s, since the inception of the band, there are, in my experience, a number of younger fans. I'm sort of one of the younger fans myself, if compared to the people who were around when This Was came out. And I think it could be interesting to both the people who have known Tull for a long time, as well as to people who are new to the band. And I don't really think that the discussion about Tull has been exhausted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because there is a lot to be talked about musically and lyrically, thematically, and historically.
Yeah, totally. And I think this was kind of part of the idea of doing a podcast, is that, like you said, the discussion on Tull, I think, hasn't been exhausted to the degree that we think that sort of a more modern form like a podcast. It's something sort of new, I think, for this kind of band and for kind of this sort of community, I guess, this kind of fan community. We're aware that, most of the Tull community sort of skews older just based on them being an older band. And I think for that reason, there's sort of an opportunity for us to sort of come in and do, I guess, a newer form of fan communication or media. So even younger fans who are getting into Tull, or who, even if, they're experienced Tull veterans or they're just getting into Tull or whatever, they can kind of have, something like this, like a podcast like this, to really sort of engage with the more like critical and thematic aspects of the material.
Yeah. Why don't you tell the listeners about yourself a little, Joey? How did you become a Tull fan, and why it matters to you and what you do? Because you are a musician, and that gives you an additional perspective on the music.
Yeah. So I'm originally from the U.S., from the great state of Texas, but I'm currently living in Japan. I've been a Tull fan since, I guess, around when I was 12 or 13. I'm 23 now. The way that I got into Tull is kind of interesting. They were really the first band or musical act that I ever really had any interest in. And so in that sense, as you mentioned, I'm a semi-professional drummer, and I've done live and recording work both in the US as well as in Japan. And so for me, Tull kind of has a special place in my heart as kind of the gatekeepers of the band that really got me into music, just sort of single-handedly. My story kind of started with my dad, where when I was growing up, my dad would often play Tull cassettes in the car, just when we were going around places. And the one album that I actually remember hearing the most, funnily enough, is Under Wraps, which is not really an album that most Tull fans, think of first when they think of Tull. And, certainly we'll get to that later. But, as a kid growing up, I didn't pay a lot of attention to it. Music was really never anything that was important for me growing up as a kid. And that sort of changed when I was 12 or so, where I remember one day my dad asked me to sort of come in the living room and sit down and watch something. And he didn't really do that very often. So it was kind of odd that he did that. And it was the clip of the 1978 Madison Square Garden show of them playing Thick as a Brick. And it was part of the 20th anniversary compilation, I think. And I don't know why, but for some reason, just that performance really stuck with me. And just sort of next thing I knew, I was buying Tull CDs and learning more about them as sort of this young kid. The best memory that I have of growing up with Tull was one of the CDs I had was the 97 remix or remaster, whatever it was, of Thick as a Brick. And back then I had one of those like those clunky CD players, with like the crappy earphones and stuff. And I was probably in 4th or 5th grade at this point. And my parents would put me to bed, and after they left, I would sort of scramble out of bed and I would grab the CD player, and almost every single night I would put on Thick as a Brick. And some nights I'd finish it and some nights I wouldn't, but I remember very vividly just kind of laying there night after night, just staring at the ceiling in the dark, listening to Thick as a Brick, and having, all those, I guess, emotions that you have whenever you discover something that you're passionate about as a kid. Where I would think about, I had no idea that music like this existed. I never knew that music could be like this. All the kids at school, they're listening to all the pop music on the radio. They have no idea that stuff like this exists, and just have like all these crazy emotions of discovering something like that. And so that was kind of like the strongest memory for me that really kickstarted my interest in Tull. And even forward to today, I actually don't listen to rock music that much today. I grew up as a huge rock fan, but today I mostly listen to hip-hop and jazz and electronic and things. But Tull still always has a really special place in my heart, and I still today would always consider them my number one favorite band. So how does your experience growing up, kind of getting into Tull, compare with that?
Well, it is different. I wanted to say that the story about listening to Thick as a Brick, lying in your bed, that's a fantastic story, because I can imagine it quite vividly. Just as a kid, sneaking up, like when you're a kid, you have to go to sleep, but then you sneak out and read a book with a torch, listen to music. That's kind of a universal thing, and to have something as epic as Thick as a Brick wrapped into that experience is wow.
Yeah, and I think it's cool. It's pretty fitting too, in like an ironic way, because like we'll of course talk about Thick as a Brick more when we get to it, but that album, like that's exactly what that album is about, conceptually. It's about being a kid growing up and being at this like particular inflection point where you discover that there's like a whole new world that you never even considered before. So it's in that sense, it's kind of funny. Yeah.
So I'm from Ukraine and I live in Ukraine. I play in a progressive psychedelic kind of band called La Horsa Bianca. I play the bass and the flute, and I actually started on the flute, sort of. When I was a kid, I had a recorder, because flutes were expensive. And one of the first pieces of music that I played on the recorder, that I learned, I had my teacher at the time write it out in musical notation, was Elegy.
Oh, wow.
From Stormwatch. Yeah, because I loved it. I specifically asked for that tune. And that was because I think I was about 8 years old when my dad, this is also a story about my dad, played me the record. We had a record player, and he played me the Soviet edition of the Original Masters Jethro Tull compilation, the blue one with Ian standing on one leg. And it had Cyrillic text on the cover. So instead of Jethro Tull, it said Jethro Tull. And my favorite track at the time, when I was an 8-year-old boy, was Bungle in the Jungle. Because my English left very much to be desired at that point, but I could very well understand I am a tiger and I am a snake.
Yeah.
And it was 100% my jam. That song with the animal noises and the stuff, it fascinated me. Several other tracks off of Original Masters I did also make note of at the time, like Too Old to Rock and Roll. We liked listening to that. And then in a while, I think Dad's girlfriend had several Chrysalis records, which were Too Old to Rock and Roll and War Child and Benefit and The Broadsword and the Beast. I think, and Stormwatch. Yeah, these were my 5 first proper Tull records. And this is where actually I got fascinated with the flute, and it started getting drawn to that and looking to get a flute. But obviously, as I said, they were expensive, so I started on the recorder, learned a few tunes, and then in some years acquired a flute and started learning it myself most of the time. So I don't have a musical education. And yeah, that's where it began. I did have a detour into different genres, just like you are right now, not in a rock music place. I started listening to rock music with the Beatles and Queen and Jethro Tull and lots of other stuff, and then listened to a bunch of folk music in my 20s. I'm now 35, and at some point I came back to listening to rock music and progressive rock specifically. That was when I decided that my next band is going to play progressive rock.
Yeah, and I mean that's a pretty that's kind of a scary decision to make, right? Especially in like in the 21st century, to try to make a progressive rock band.
Yeah, kind of, but it was sort of a realization at some point that this is the kind of music that I always wanted to play.
Yeah,
and would play if I could. And at some point I realized that I actually could. And then it just was the matter of finding the right people. So, yeah, and Tull, this is the kind of band that they've been with me for most of my life. Because when I was at the point when I was learning Elegy on the recorder, I had lots of Tull cassettes. I collected a big part of their discography on cassettes, recorded them from friends and from little kiosks where you could bring a tape and have them record some music onto it for some fee. Yeah, sort of.
I've never actually heard of that before. I wonder if that was a European thing.
Yeah, that was the kind of music piracy that was very popular here before the internet. Like people who had music collections could make money off of them by recording it onto tapes for other people. So yeah, that's where I'm at the time. I in my band I mostly play the bass, but when I have the odd moment when my hands are not occupied with it, I play the flute and the saxophone. So I sort of came back to listening to Tull.
Would you say that Tull are the reason that you play flute?
Yeah, obviously. No doubt about it.
I think it's a great story because, I mean, even back like decades ago, you know, people talked and music journalists wrote about Ian Anderson making the flute cool. And, I think to what degree he actually did that maybe is debatable. But, I mean, certainly it's really cool to see decades later that he's still inspiring people to take up flute and pursue serious musical careers with it.
Well, I won't really call my music endeavors a career.
Sure.
Because we're not a professional band in the sense of making any kind of anything off of it. We all have day jobs, but yeah, we're having tons of fun in the meantime.
So one of the things that we kind of talked about when we were setting up this podcast is, the core of what we want to do here is to take you through all of the albums and review everything in sort of a critical light, giving our reactions, looking at the themes and everything. But that being said, I think the scope of this podcast is not necessarily limited to that. There's a lot of different other kinds of topics that I think that we can look at in like an episodic format. So, we've talked about doing, we could do episodes just on Jethro Tull bassists or on Jethro Tull drummers, or we can do the Ian solo stuff, or we can do the live albums or the B-sides or whatever. So, we're just getting started doing this. We're both newbies to podcast production, but
oh yeah, absolutely.
Our hope is that this is going to go beyond just sort of our mission, I guess, of getting through the albums. We want to create sort of a comprehensive catalog of different discussions about the band that Tull fans and people who are interested in Tull can listen to. But before we sort of get to that, just to start off with, since you're a bassist, Eugene, I want to ask you, who is your favorite Tull bass player?
Well, difficult to say really, because as a bass player, I haven't really learned a lot of Tull tunes on the bass. And I think what fascinates me about most Tull bassists is the way that their thinking is very different from mine. Because some of my bass heroes are like Paul McCartney and Phil Lesh. And Tull bassists are very different. Also very melodic, but in a kind of different sort of way. And I'm still, learning to pass that. And I would like to get more into how Cornick is different from Jeffrey Hammond and Dave Pegg. And I think I really like Glenn Cornick, and I really like Jeffrey Hammond. I can't choose between them. They're very different, obviously, but they kind of both completely rule.
Yeah, Jeffrey's an interesting one, and I want to save some of this discussion for if we ever do an episode later. But just the fact that he wasn't a musician, and I think even when he left the band, he would still say that he wasn't a musician.
Yeah.
Especially coming from a very prolific player like Glenn Cornick, I think that was a pretty big switch.
Yeah, I agree. And to me, I think talking Tull with a drummer as a bassist, this is one of the things I'm really looking forward to, because Tull is such a complex band musically and rhythmically, and there's so much to discuss in that regard. We want to promise that we won't go 100% music nerd on our listeners, but there will be moments where talk of time signatures and things will be at the forefront.
Yeah, totally. But I think, even for me, my whole job is supposed to be a rhythm person, but a lot of the time signature rhythmic stuff of Tull I can't even begin to explain in words that make sense, because it's so out there that even in Thick as a Brick, just the amount of time signature changes on that album are ridiculous, right? And so I wouldn't even be able to talk in correct, accurate terms about something like that if I wanted to.
Yeah, we could figure that out, but some of them are really acrobatic,
right?
Basically, because it's not something that you can pass from the first time when you listen to it, because sometimes it's just completely incomprehensible and you only get what had happened in retrospect.
Yeah.
Even not if we don't talk about Thick as a Brick, try playing Fillingdale Flyer to a musician, to an accomplished musician, and get him to tell you the time signature from the intro.
Right, yeah. Rhythmically, Tull, that's part of why I love Tull. I think you touched on it a little bit earlier, but I think they're sort of underrated as a band when it comes to the sheer diversity of their material, where I guess the common music audience sort of thinks of Tull as a classic rock band, I guess, kind of lumping them in with bands like The Who and Fleetwood Mac and that kind of era. And usually that's because of radio play on classic rock radio, of Aqualung, Locomotive Breath, Teacher, things, even Bungle in the Jungle, like you mentioned. But
too old for rock and roll, I imagine.
Yeah, totally. But their band, when you really sit and get into their catalog, you see that the range of their styles are extremely wide for a band of that era. They had an entire period in the 80s where they were arguably an electronic rock band, right? Which is kind of crazy when you think about it. So that's what's always drawn them to me. I think they've always navigated a diverse set of styles in a really interesting and unique way, which no other band really has. I'm sure you agree with this, but I'm a personal fan of Ian Anderson, just in that I think he brought a lot of intelligence and class to the rock world that had never really been seen in that way before.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And I think that's what's kind of always tied me to Tull, aside from them kind of being a gateway to music for me. And so, even 11 or 12 years later, I still go into periods where I'm always going back to Tull, always going back through the old albums, and I never get tired of them. They're always strong and unique still for me today.
Yeah, there's always something new you'll discover.
And just as a last point on this, I think that diversity is part of what's going to make this podcast series so interesting to listen to, I think, because the albums change so much and the thematic differences are so vast that I think it's going to be really interesting for us to take on the different eras of Tull history and see sort of our own personal reactions to them, as well as on a more critical level how the themes change in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope we live up to that.
So we, if you're listening to this is, episode 0, the intro episode. Our first proper episode, our review analysis of This Was, is up now. So if you're interested in diving in, please feel free to click away and dive into This Was as we go through track by track. Otherwise, if you'd like to get in contact with us, feel free. You can email us at vernacularverbose@gmail.com. Feel free to like our Facebook page, follow on Twitter, all that. Please share on Facebook with Jethro Tull fans or friends if you're interested. And we're looking forward to what's going to be many, many, many months of bringing you Tull material and reactions to Tull albums. And I'm really excited. This is an idea that I've been wanting to do for a long time. This is, as a Tull fan, this is the kind of podcast that I would really be interested in listening to. So, I hope that we can sort of live up to fan expectations and promote some really good discussion about this music that we all love so much.
What Joey said.
Great. So, check out This Was. I guess before we go, I should mention our sort of rough timetable is that we want to get an episode out every 2 weeks. But given that, we're totally new to podcasts and we're still sort of figuring out the workload and how we're going to be outsourcing things, that could change. But that's sort of our plan. And of course, if that changes, we'll let people know online and social media and all that kind of thing.
That's it for us today. Cheers.
Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time.